Ruslan just shared a video in which he encourages Alex O'Connor to give Christianity a try. Here's how the video starts.
Okay, let me pitch this to you as a non-combative non-believer, okay? And I feel like you've said stuff like, I want to believe. I think in your conversation with Ayan Hirsi Ali, like, I want to believe, but I just can't. And so
yes, non-resistant is a term from J.L. Schellenberg, and I'm certainly combative in many respects, but
okay, non-resistant
is a different thing, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so non-resistant, you are combative, obviously within this entire back and forth about the West stuff.
Alex calls himself a combative, non-resistant, non-believer. Now, initially, that statement struck me as an oxymoron. How could you be both combative and yet not resistant at the same time? Well, this got me wondering, is Alex O'Connor genuinely a non-resistant non-believer? He often claims that he is, that if he was given sufficient evidence for belief, like a religious experience, he would come to belief. He wants to believe, he's open to believe. But I don't think that's true, and the reason why is fascinating. If you haven't met me, I'm Dr. Christopher Kloos, a committed Christian with a PhD in philosophy. I created this channel to help Christians answer today's toughest skeptical challenges. If you get something out of this video, please be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel, and then also stick around till the end for a fascinating result that comes out of this. Now, before I argue that Alex is a resistive non-believer, I want to clarify what I am not saying to avoid any confusion. I'm not saying Alex is insincere when he says he wants to believe in God. I'm not saying all people who claim to be non-resistant non-believers are like secretly resistive. I'm not saying Alex, for instance, has some hidden moral defect or sin that unbeknownst to him is causing his disbelief. Sometimes you hear these claims out of apologists and it drives me crazy. So then you might say, well, why are you making this video? Well, Alex, as you know, has a huge following, over 1 million subscribers, very important public figure concerning atheism. So what he says has a huge impact on people. And in many ways, he's been an asset to Christianity. For instance, recently pressing Jordan Peterson on Jesus. If you stuck a camcorder outside the tomb, would you see Jesus walk out, for instance? So I genuinely care about Alex for many reasons. And I feel like he's stuck. He unknowingly has put himself in a position which makes him coming to believe in Christianity very difficult. So I want to shed light on why this might be the case in hopes that it removes a roadblock to his path to Christ. You'll notice in the video, Alex mentioned philosopher J.L. Schellenberg. And as you may know, he created an argument from divine hiddenness against God to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. Alex is borrowing that concept of non-resistant non-belief from Schellenberg, but you'll see kind of Schellenberg's notion itself needs to be further refined, as we'll see. So according to Schellenberg, a non-resistant non-believer is someone who doesn't believe in God, but that isn't the result of some sort of resistance on their part, and we'll kind of cash that out. Schellenberg gives 3 examples of people who resist God. So first, you might just carelessly investigate the evidence for God. You might be sloppy with the evidence you consider, the arguments you consider, how you respond to them, and you might commit a bunch of fallacies or just sort of fail to deeply engage with the issue. So that's the first way you could be a resistive non-believer. And then secondly, you could just deliberately be selective. You could only hang out with atheists. You could only avoid spending time with believers and kind of just stay in an echo chamber that will just reinforce your perspective that God doesn't exist. And the key word there is deliberately. So for Schellenberg, there has to be some kind of intentional aspect going on that causes your disbelief. Then the third way is you might just sort of mentally drift. You might just sort of stop thinking about whether God exists and sort of unknowns to you, kind of not be putting yourself in situations where you could consider evidence for God. And it's a little more subtle than like social choices or careless investigation, but you might just sort of let yourself drift away from potential evidence. So kind of the common thread through all of this is that the person is in some way contributing to their own loss of belief through choices that limit their exposure to evidence for God. Now, the key is that there's some kind of agency going on, whether that's careless methods of investigating the evidence, deliberate social choices, or just kind of a passive acceptance of drift away from even thinking about God, whether God exists. And so basically the person's participating in conditions that make belief unlikely, a lot less likely. They are, as Schellenberg sort of says, turning the light off or closing their eyes to whether God exists. And he thinks there's a self-deceptive element. There can be. They might even say they desire a relationship with God. But if you look at all of what they do and, sort of how they act, they're doing things that put them in a position where they couldn't come to a relationship with God just by trying. So that's resistive non-believers. Now, does Alex fall in any of these categories? Has he become an obviously resistive non-believer in Schellenberg's sense? Well, he claims no desire to avoid God. His investigations appear very careful. In fact, he's calling out theists on their stuff. He's not careless, for sure, with the evidence. He engages with believers rather than avoiding them. And it doesn't seem like his non-belief is just through mental drift. In fact, he's very actively engaged with thinking about God. Now, what if I told you, though, there's a different way to create conditions that make belief less likely, and Alex is doing just that. So Schellenberg emphasizes this causal relationship. Resistance must cause the non-belief. Even without conscious desires or careless actions to sort of avoid God or belief that God exists, O'Connor's systematic generation of defeaters could be seen as creating self-deceptive conditions causing his non-belief. So by doing all of this arguing against God in public, he is actually perhaps unconsciously creating the conditions under which it would be extremely difficult for him to come to belief in God. And in that sense, he may be resisting it. Now, that's a little fast though, right? So here's where things get interesting. There's something called higher order evidence. Higher order evidence is evidence that affects our ability to evaluate other evidence properly. So think about this. If you're taking a test, an exam, and you learn that you've been given some kind of medication that impairs your reasoning, that's higher order evidence that you should take your answers, your confidence in your answers should be much lower. You should take your answers much less seriously, regardless of how obvious they seem, right? You've been given this higher order evidence that defeats you taking seriously the evidence that you're making good answers. You can be confident in your answers. But the tricky thing is that it may in that moment really appear to you that you're getting it right. But you have this higher order evidence that you've been taking some kind of medication that's messing with your reasoning. So that causes you, even despite your first order evidence of confidence in your answers, you should lower your confidence in your answers. It's higher order evidence that casts light on your evidence. So let me break down a few features of higher order evidence. So what defines higher order evidence? Well, it's evidence that can tell against our rational capacities, our epistemic situation, or our ability to evaluate evidence correctly. So going back to the exam, you might say, well, I'm really confident I got this right. But then you get this higher order evidence that you've been taking some medication that's messing up your reasoning. So that might cause you to not be able to evaluate that evidence correctly. You might be overconfident in what you believe, given this other evidence that you have. Now, the classic example of higher order evidence is if you're at risk of hypoxia while flying, hypoxia is where you have low levels of oxygen in your body tissues and blood, and it causes confusion, restlessness, difficulty breathing, rapid heart rate, and even bluish skin, right? So if you are flying and you have a risk of hypoxia, and you're doing some work, you got your laptop out, and you may or may not be, experiencing these symptoms unbeknownst to you, then you should, when you're doing your work, you probably should lower your confidence that you're doing effective work. You could, I'm sure you've had this happen where you're drowsy or sleepy. You may not have a hypoxia, but you think you're doing great work. Close your laptop, you open it up the next day and you go, whoa, that is sloppy. I'm making no sense. And at the time you may have said, yeah, I was doing a great job, but you were drowsy. And so higher order evidence that you're drowsy, that you're tired, that you might have hypoxia when flying should lower your confidence in the evidence you have that you've done really great work or gotten great answers on a test. Now, when higher order evidence impacts someone, it is agent relative often. That is, it applies only to their beliefs and reasoning. If Asha, for instance, going back to our example, learns she might be hypoxic, this should affect how she views her own conclusions, but it doesn't affect how others should view the same evidence. Let's say she's on the plane and she's suffering. She knows she's suffering from hypoxia, and it looks like there's a purple elephant on her the tray next to her, right? And it's really just a some kind of like purple stuffed animal or something. And she really sees it as she's kind of starting to get delirious and hallucinate a little, and she sees it as a purple elephant, right? Well, if the fact that she can suffer from hypoxia, she might be suffering from hypoxia, should give her less confidence in the evidence that the appearance as of purple elephants on the tray next to her. But the same person, let's say her neighbor, another seat down, that shouldn't affect how they evaluate the evidence, because if they're not suffering from hypoxia, they'd be viewing it as a purple stuffed animal, right? So it can impact, its agent relative. Higher order evidence can impact different people differently and doesn't necessarily apply to how everyone should evaluate all evidence. Additionally, there can be what's called independent effects. So higher order evidence can work independently of belief content. So it can affect just your reasoning process and not specific beliefs. So like going back to the sleep deprived example, you might learn you're sleep deprived, and it can affect all your reasoning, not just your reasoning on particular topics, right? Not just your reasoning on belief in God, say, but your reasoning on where you left your keys or what you ate for breakfast, right? You're just sort of sleep deprived and not maybe fully engaged intellectually or cognitively. So this object independence means that higher order evidence can create systemic effects across many beliefs. Okay. And then next we have the bracketing requirement. When we get higher order evidence, we have to bracket or set aside some of our first order evidence or reasoning. So going back to the hypoxia example of hallucinating because you're losing oxygen to the brain and such, a purple elephant on the tray next to you. Well, Asha should bracket that appearance, right? And say, whoa, oh, that's right. I might be I suffer from hypoxia on airplanes. I shouldn't put much credence in the fact that I'm looking at a purple elephant, right? What is it? And then the person next to her could say, "What's a stuffed animal?" She said, "Oh, okay. I was seeing a purple elephant," right? So it can create like this unusual epistemic situation where we kind of can't use the reasoning that's been questioned to defend itself, right? Because the reasoning itself is under question. So you can't reason your way out of it. That's why I suggested, hey, ask your neighbor, right? Who could be evaluating the evidence properly. And Otherwise, you'd be like trying to like check if your ruler's accurate by using your ruler, the very tool of measurement that you're trying to see whether it is appropriate or proper. Additionally, it can be predictably misleading. So unlike regular evidence that generally makes us more accurate when we properly assess it, higher order evidence can predictably lead us away from truth even when we respond to it rationally. So this creates many challenges from higher order evidence because rationally responding to it can make us less accurate about the first order facts, right? So it can take us away from what is actually the case, what we're actually seeing, right? It can, in some cases, make us more accurate, but it can also predictably mislead us as well, as you'll see in the Alex case. And then lastly, there's interaction with evidence. So higher order evidence doesn't erase our first order evidence, but it affects how we can use it. And the evidence is still there, but we might not be able to rationally rely on it. And this is going to create a bunch of questions about how to weigh different types of evidence against each other. Now let's return this to the specific case of Alex O'Connor. So the systemic ways that higher order evidence can impact our reasoning means it could create resistance even when we're perfectly open to evidence. So we could be completely open to the evidence before us, and yet the higher order evidence could actually be creating resistance. So let's apply this to Alex O'Connor. So through his YouTube channel, as you may know, and his philosophical work, he regularly generates arguments against God. He regularly takes the combative approach, just meaning he stands in opposition to arguments for God or God's existence or Christianity. Each video, each argument, each debate, he's debated a lot, creates higher order evidence that affects how he evaluates religious claims. So this evidence works in three key ways. First, his professional content creation builds up a framework of skepticism that filters how he sees new evidence. So he has this higher order evidence that he should be skeptical about the first order evidence concerning God, and that's going to filter through and impact how he's evaluating that first order evidence. Second, his public platform and identity has become tied to atheism. Now, to his credit, his identity and platform was tied to veganism when he started out, but he now has confessed he eats meat. So he is an interesting case because even though he's making a ton of money, I'm sure, from his YouTube channel, his identity, he gets a lot of praise and credit because he's a great interviewer and great thinker. It still may be the case that he's willing to shove that aside, but it's still going to create resistance. You know, do you want to go there again? Do you want to suffer the effects you suffered when you switched from veganism to eating some meat and you lost all those subscribers? You lost all that money. It was painful. Now, do you want to do that and become a theist? And so that could create a psychological barrier to belief. And then third, his arguments contribute to this sort of broader skeptical environment that makes belief more difficult. He's contributing to the skepticism on YouTube, and that can make belief more difficult. Although he's also, as I mentioned at the beginning, doing great work on the other side, perhaps unbeknownst to him. That may play into what we're discussing as well. So first, how does this bear on O'Connor's rational capacities? Well, higher order evidence questions our ability, remember, to reason correctly or assess the evidence properly. And O'Connor's arguments against God could make him doubt his own ability to fairly evaluate theistic evidence. If he finds himself always on the opposing side and discounting evidence for God and arguments for God and always going on the, offensive against any argument for God, this should give him reason to suspect maybe he's not correctly or fairly evaluating the evidence. It could create the uncertainty regarding how he's weighing the evidence. And this can affect sort of his meta-level assessment of his own thinking. So even unbeknownst to him, he may be suspicious of his own thinking or how he's evaluating the evidence. He could state, no, I'm being very fair. And to first blush, he appears very fair and even-handed. But given that he's always taking the opposing side, that can create a meta level of, again, filtering through the skepticism and maybe make him think, maybe I'm not quite sort of as open-minded as I thought. And this could be a subconscious thing because it could just be higher order evidence about the reliability of his reasoning or the accuracy of his reasoning on theistic issues. Now, regarding object independence, remember, higher order evidence affects beliefs regardless of their content. It has more of a systemic effect, so it's not dependent on the objects of the propositions you're considering. And his methods generate these general skeptical patterns, right? And the same reasoning could undermine any theological argument or religious experience. So even if he had a religious experience, or if God is working through people like Ruslan to try to bring him to Christ and show him the light, it could, that skeptical reasoning that's up at a higher level could actually impact his ability to receive that evidence and evaluate it fairly and embrace it, right? And this can be a systemic effect rather than targeted at specific beliefs. So he might say, no, I'm not resistant to theistic beliefs, but actually the higher order evidence is impacting the whole web of beliefs because it's targeting the reasoning that created the beliefs and your ability to be confident in your reasoning concerning the beliefs. And again, it could be predictably misleading. So even if theism were true, O'Connor's arguments would still create defeaters, right? And that higher order evidence could systematically lead him away from truth, even when rationally processed, right? So you could rationally process the evidence, and yet the defeaters could kick in as higher order evidence and make you question the first order evidence and be sort of defeaters of that first order evidence, right? And the more arguments he generates, the stronger those misleading effects can become. Additionally, the bracketing requirements. So you got to set aside first order evidence when higher order evidence applies. Remember the playing. You need to, Asha needs to set aside her first order appearance as of a pink elephant and ask someone else, what they're seeing. So actually, O'Connor would need to discount his own philosophical work. He can't use his own arguments to validate his skepticism because that'll create like an epistemic trap or cycle. He can't easily escape the higher order evidence influence if it keeps impacting what he believes first order, and then that impacts and creates defeaters up at a higher level, and then that further impacts the first order and so on. And so even unbeknownst to him, he can be going round in circles of skepticism, defeating him from actually fairly evaluating the evidence, again, unbeknownst to him. So this framework suggests that O'Connor's resistance operates at a deep structural level through higher order evidence mechanisms, regardless of his conscious openness to evidence. So by regularly creating these defeaters of his religious belief, O'Connor can create an intellectual resistance that he's not even aware of. And it's not that he's consciously closing himself off to the evidence. At the first order conscious level, he's probably open to the evidence. Again, that's why I said I don't think he's insincere when he says he genuinely wants to believe or is open to believing. It's that all his philosophical work has generated that higher order evidence that systematically affects how he processes any potential evidence for God. Now, you might say, wait a minute, don't theistic philosophers do the same thing? And you'd be right. So by regularly creating content on this channel, I'm generating higher order evidence that could make me resistant to atheism, right? Just as O'Connor's work could make him resistant to theism. And I might not even be aware of it, right? So this creates an interesting symmetry in the debate. However, there's an important asymmetry to consider, but we'll get to that in a minute. first, we need to talk about the elephant in the room. And no, I'm not talking about a pink elephant in the room. At least as far as I know, I'm not suffering from hypoxia or hallucinating or anything like that. Something is changing in Alex. You may have noticed this. It seems he's becoming more open to Christianity and the mysterious aspects of the events around the resurrection. He definitely doesn't seem to be like a militant atheist or going around saying God doesn't exist. And think about his humility in contrast with more militant and I would say belligerent channels. And trust me, this happens on the other side. But you can think about atheist channels that like Rationality Rules and Myth Vision that are just so overconfident in their views and so anti-theist and pro God does not exist, that's a very strong form of atheism that I don't think any longer, even if it ever did, really suits or defines Alex's current cognitive situation. So one way of making sense of what's going on with Alex is he's transitioning from a stronger form of atheism to a weaker form. So strong atheism, again, is the claim that God doesn't exist. But what you hear kind of percolating and said by Alex is that he just thinks there isn't sufficient evidence for God, right? And this shift matters because if he's moving toward weak atheism, this will change the epistemological dynamics. So instead of defending a positive claim that God doesn't exist, he'd be taking the more modest position that, hey, the theistic evidence is insufficient. So this might change how we evaluate his potential resistance. So for strong atheism, if he were a strong atheist, and he might be still to some degree, because he has gone on and argued the biblical God doesn't exist and so on. So he still may have a stronger position, but if he does, then his higher order evidence would make him resistant to properly evaluating both the evidence for God and potential problems with his own arguments for God's non-existence. And as you may have seen, Cameron Bertuzzi, I think did a good job just pointing out how Alex didn't perform as well as he could have in his debate against the Connect pleas. And I don't know, maybe he was suffering from some of that here. He had more confidence in his evidence and his own arguments for God's non-existence or the God of the Bible's non-existence than he should have. And that's going to create similar problems for theistic resistance, right? Because he's defending a similar claim. Because the burden of proof is going to apply to his position. He's arguing that God does not exist. That's a positive claim, and he's going to bear the burden of proof for that. But if he really is shifting to weak atheism, then his higher order evidence is primarily going to affect how he evaluates theistic evidence. So it can still be problematic, though, because his position can be just justified by pointing out, hey, there's insufficient theistic evidence there, but that might give him, given the higher order evidence of creating all these defeaters, that should perhaps give him a little less confidence in his claims. And that might be what we're seeing, a little bit more humility, a little less confidence in his claims about God's non-existence, more focus on critiquing theistic arguments. You may have noticed he's really getting into theism and pursuing it, wrestling with it. And I know that's his background, but at the same time, he does seem to be really focusing on critiquing theistic arguments and saying they're insufficient rather than trying to prove atheism, a positive claim that God does not exist. There may be greater emphasis on the burden of proof lying with theism. So if you're truly a weak atheist, you can say, look, insufficient evidence, and you've got the burden of proof. Theist, you're saying God exists. I'm just saying not sufficient evidence. So burden of proof with you. However, so this would restore the symmetry. Remember, the theist is like, creating defeaters. I'm making this content, creating defeaters and higher order evidence that defeats my ability to clearly evaluate the atheistic evidence, right? And then the claim was, well, that's kind of the same position as the atheist, right? So the atheist is responding And the claim is that would be parallel if we're talking about strong atheism and strong theism, positive case for both. But if we're talking about weak atheism, then there's this asymmetry going on, right? But it could be the fact he might be generating sort of less defeaters and so on, but that accumulated higher order evidence from his earlier strong atheist period or some of the other work that he's doing can create lasting resistance even as his explicit position changes. And he might go back and forth between the positions, right? When he's out doing strong atheist arguments against God, that God does not exist, he's generating all these defeaters instead of just kicking back and saying, no, that evidence isn't sufficient. But again, remember, there's this higher order systemic effect going on, and that could affect just his ability to reason about the sufficiency of the theistic evidence that he's looking at. So the key question kind of emerges. If Alex is still a strong atheist, then there's a symmetry, but both atheists and theists are generating higher order evidence through their philosophical work. So the question is, like, does that create a stalemate? Are we just both like, we're becoming more entrenched in our positions through all that higher order evidence we generate? We're becoming less and less genuinely non-resistant toward the other side. We're all unbeknownst to us, creating resistance and becoming less and less open to belief in no God or belief in God. So this suggests, this is sort of where the surprising stuff comes about. We need to really think about how to engage in philosophical debate while minimizing problematic higher order evidence. So this kind of emerges, whether certain positions regarding religious epistemology are less vulnerable to higher order evidence problems. If there are ways to bracket our own higher order evidence when evaluating arguments, for instance, saying, I'm just going to do my best to take this argument on its own terms, trying to set aside all the other stuff I have in my toolkit, so to speak, that may be coming against this argument. Let me try my best to fairly evaluate it and bracket all that higher order evidence that are defeaters for how I might evaluate or reason about this piece of evidence. Those are all important things to consider, but I think, if nothing else, they should give us a humility when putting forward our positions. And to talk on the other side, I think theists, some of the more popular apologists and counter-apologists too, are more sensational and almost stubbornly confident in their positions because they're not aware of this impact that higher order evidence can have on their views. So while O'Connor might believe he's open to evidence for God's existence, the higher order evidence he's generated through his work suggests otherwise. Now, this doesn't mean he's intellectually dishonest. Far from it. Rather, it highlights a fascinating philosophical puzzle about how our own arguments can make us resistant to changing our minds in ways we don't realize. What do you think? Is it possible to be a professional critic of religion and remain truly non-resistant to religious belief? Returning to Alex's statement himself, is it possible to be a combative, non-resistant non-believer? Or is that just like a contradiction in terms? Let me know in the comments. If you found this interesting, you'll like this video where I debate an atheist on Schellenberg's hiddenness argument.